What's up, everybody? It's guubums back with another comps video. For those of you guys who don't know who I am, I'm a competitive player from North America, currently rank 2, so I'm doing quite well, and I haven't made a comps video for this patch yet, and I think this patch kind of introduced a lot of new comps into the meta, so I guess there's going to be a couple things that you guys are probably not that familiar with, just because I mean these comps haven't really been around for that long, and even if they had kind of like previously been explored or something like that, then there have been like adjustments or adaptations made since you guys have played it to make it slightly more unfamiliar. And I guess like with that said, let's just get into the video. So first up, the best comp in the meta is Duelist. I actually got a lot of comments on my previous comps video about the Duelist section, just like, oh, it's not that good, or like I'm not doing that well with it. At the end of the day, I can't really ensure that pretty much it's being played optimally when you guys are playing it, but I do know for a fact this is the strongest comp in the game. I think if you guys have been following any streamers or even like myself, or I guess like any tournaments lately, you'll notice that duelists have had an extremely high win share. Both they perform really well at like in terms of winning the game, as well as just like doing well in terms of average placement as well. So okay, how do we get into this comp, I guess, is like where we should start. Ideally, you're just really playing around Lee Sin items. I know in the past that a lot of people are more used to playing around like Volibear 3 or Tristana 3 or maybe both. This is no longer the case. Even at the highest level at like Challenger Plus, I still see people doing this. I think if you do that, you're like extremely misplaying your game, honestly. It's really bad to kind of just like opt into a Volibear Tristana reroll, especially if you're staying level 7. This is a comp that generally needs to go level 8 because your main carries are going to be Lee Sin and Irelia, and if you stay on 7, the likelihood that you hit a Lee Sin 2 or even an Irelia 1, Wukong 1 is another thing that spikes you really hard. It's just really unlikely, so it's really bad to stay on 7 and reroll. You should be focused on like just playing around Lee Sin more than Irelia, just because obviously it's a 4 cost instead of a 5 cost, and Irelia spikes your board so hard anyway that like it doesn't matter if you have items for it or not. Eventually you could just like so most of the time like Tristana's holding these items in the mid game, right? And then eventually you can just downgrade your Tristana, so you have a Tristana 1 on bench, and upgrade to Irelia 1, and she's just going to perform a lot stronger than this Tristana. That being said, sometimes you're rolling on 8 and you just happen to find a lot of Volibears or a lot of Tristanas. If you happen to have an item for them, you can feel free to reroll them. But actually the best unit to reroll in this comp is not Volibear or Tristana, it's actually Qiyana. So Qiyana is the strongest unit of the 3, just in terms of pure power, and although she's like slightly or significantly less likely to probably be able to actually 3-star her, she's going to be the strongest upgrade you can get if you manage to 3-star any single unit. So you should look out for that, and then in that case, obviously Qiyana is being gifted with some of the late game items. Sterax, BT, Gunblade actually perform really well on her. I believe Edge of Night or GA also performs really well on her, probably her single best item, but obviously you are once again kind of like playing for Lee Sin items more than anything, so like if you have suboptimal Qiyana items, even at 3-star, it's not going to be all that big of an issue. That being said, please do not reroll on 6 for Qiyana 3. It's just not worth it, because at that point, once again, you're just not going to have odds to hit Lee Sin. Lee Sin best in slot is roughly BT, Sterax, and Titans. Most of these can be replaced. I think BT is probably the most mandatory one. He performs a lot better with BT than pretty much any other item. Obviously, these other 2 items are very powerful, but you can't always have this exact item setup. Sometimes you're having double Titans or double Sterax. Sometimes you have double BT. Sometimes you have a QSS. There is going to be like a optimal set of items you can make in any given spot or any given game, and you should try to just like lean closest to this as possible. But if you can't achieve this and you can get items elsewhere, then that's also really good. Otherwise, Irelia best in slot is just red buff. Hurricane is her best single item outside of red buff and Morello, but at the end of the day, because Hurricane builds out of a bow and a cloak, these are obviously your BT Titans components, it's not as easy to make it. But if you have a Hurricane in the early game and you are playing around like a win streak, say you have a Tristana 1 or Qiyana 2 and you want to put Hurricane on one of those 2 units, then Hurricane's a really excellent streak item, so that's definitely something you should be doing. And then you should probably, at that point, you're looking to find like Lee Sin items a little bit later, but it is still important to kind of like get that Lee Sin online, because he is your main carry as well as like obviously your main tank. Yeah, you do want to be looking for that. And then something about this comp specifically is that it's really augment, it really abuses augments. So it's not so augment dependent in that like you need specific augments to be able to do well with this comp, but there are a lot of augments in the game that this comp uses really well that other comps are not using that well, I guess, right? And one of the main ones is going to be keepers. Either tier 1 or tier 2 will both do really well, but also stuff like extended duel or dual spat, and these are like obviously comp specific augments that are going to kind of like stretch your comp further. But stuff like keepers, gifts from the fallen, martyr, combat caster, all the support augments. So there is some sort of rough support item tier list for this comp, but without delving too deep into it, I guess the main ones you should be looking for are Locket, Banshee's Veil, Aegis, and Moonstone. So Aegis of the Legion and Moonstone. So those are the 4 you should probably be mainly looking for. That being said, there's so many of these that are actually pretty good. Virtue of the Martyr is really good, Obsidian Cleaver is really good, and Brandis is really good. And I guess like what happens when a comp uses all these different, I guess, support items really well is that something like 5 Vintage becomes really, really strong. So 5 Vintage is like one of the best things you can open with this comp. You just sack most of your early and mid game, you build 5 Vintage items, you kind of like aggressively look for the support items I mentioned earlier, and eventually you just try to find your Lee Sin items. Maybe you hold a couple components so that you can still make Lee Sin items, and then you sack every other component into 5 Vintage that you can, and then eventually you'll end up with like a 2 to 3 item Lee Sin in the late game. You probably finish off your items with Raptors drops, and then you'll just have a lot of support items, and your team will just function as normally. So yeah, 5 Vintage as of right now is played generally through Duelist, and then generally speaking, when you're capping out, you're going to be playing around either Wukong on 8. Another cap out option is to play Diana, Rakan, Janna on 9. So this comp actually fits. Obviously, you have to take on one of these duelists. It doesn't actually matter which one you're playing, right? So I have 7 duelists in right now. But this thing on the left right here is 9 units. This is a really strong way to play your level 9. If you have Duelist Spat, you're most likely going to be playing a Duelist. Generally, you just play Duelist Wukong in that case, and you're not going to be looking for the Dragon Lord package. Alternatively, if you take something like New Recruit, where you have a Tactician's Crown or Force of Nature, then you can actually fit this entire board, obviously minus Yasuo or Darius, depending on which one you have upgraded, on 9. So this is 10 units. If you have a Fawn, then you can fit this on 9, and this is generally speaking going to win any game you can get it online or top 2. I actually play this comp a lot, and I credit a lot of my climb to it. Obviously, it's the strongest comp in the game, so I'm going to be playing it kind of unabashedly. You guys should be doing it too. If it's not as popular at you guys' elo, then you guys can probably be, I guess, like using this to just supplement most of your climb. It's just a really strong comp, so if you ever get the spot for this comp, you should be playing it. And before we get into the next comp, I just want to say, if you guys like the content, please like and subscribe. Leave a comment down for the feedback that you wish to see, and otherwise all my socials are also down in the description, so if you guys want to check that out, please go ahead and do so. And yeah, let's get on with the video. Next we have Reroll Zyra Ghostlies. So this is a relatively new comp. This is not going to be something that you guys have seen probably yet, just because before this current patch, this was a very underexplored line. I actually think it was probably playable in the past patches as well, but because at the time we were kind of like leaning towards a center reroll, and then Ghostly got nerfed for a bit, but in the most recent patch they actually buffed Ghostly by a significant amount. So because they buffed Ghostly by a significant amount, then you'll see comps like this popping up. This comp's a little bit interesting because I think there's like a couple ways you can go about playing it. There's a Zyra main version and there's a Zoe main version. I'd say the Zoe main version is probably stronger, but it's less accessible just because Zoe's a 3 cost. So right now with this comp, it's really tough to find yourself re-rolling Alawi and Zoe, just because Alawi's played, as you guys will see in some of my other comps, in pretty much every comp right now. Her 3 tags, Ghostly, Arcanist, and Warden, are so good that it's just really easy to fit her in any comp. And even beyond that, she's actually just a really strong unit, regardless of her tags. So it's just really difficult to kind of 3-star Alawi right now. I think if it was easier to 3-star Alawi, you would see a lot more Alawi Zoe reroll. But because that's not the case, then you're going to see a lot more stuff like Zyra, Aatrox, and Shen reroll. Aatrox specifically just got buffed significantly in the most recent patch to make him a lot tankier. I don't know if you guys have played that much, but if you guys have run into him, especially in the mid game, he's definitely living a lot longer than he used to be. So look out for that. So this comp is fairly simple to get into. Most of the time, it's just going to be played out of like Zyra in your stage 2. If you have Zyra Storyweaver, most of the time, obviously, you won't have Zoe. You'll have something like a Sivir and a Garen instead. But this is just going to be your level 6 board. So if you have this opener with Riven, then you're going to be playing around Storyweaver with Zyra, and then you start filling out the rest of your units with some Ghostlies. Obviously, if you have Alawi, it pairs really well with Garen. But even if you don't have Alawi, Riven pairs really well with Aatrox. So Garen or Riven are perfectly acceptable. The reason why I chose to put Riven in the opening comp sheet is just because Riven pairs better when you make it to higher levels and you start fitting in something like a Soraka or a Rakan for Altruist. Riven gets a little bit better that way. But yes, so your level 6 board is generally going to look something like this, these 4 units, and then you're going to play Morgana at 7. So the thing with this comp is that you don't really want to be sitting on level 6 for that long, just rerolling for these, just because you spike really hard with just 1 Morgana, right? Obviously, it gives you 4 Ghostly, it gives you 2 Sage. There's a lot of benefits to being able to go 7 and finding that Morgana to put in, but you also want to be able to hit your Zyra 3, Aatrox 3, Shen 3, and even in some cases, Alawi 3 and Zoe 3 are playable for. So just kind of like find the balance between rolling for enough copies on 6 and then also being able to go 7 to get your spike in. without hitting your 3 stars. And the kind of great thing about this comp is that it has a really, really strong early game, just because Storyweaver is one of the strongest openers, if not the strongest opener in the game. So if you get Zyra out of your stage 1 drops, then you're already well on your way to being able to kind of like perform really well on stage 2. And then it has one of the strongest stage 3s because most people aren't rolling on stage 3. So if you have this board on stage 3, the thing is most people won't be able to beat you. Obviously you do need to have some items, you do need to have some upgrades. Going into stage 3 with no upgrades is obviously not a recipe for success, but as soon as you have a couple upgrades, you can probably streak most of stage 3, if not all of stage 3, with just this board. And then as for scaling and augments, it's kind of weird. This comp doesn't like particularly abuse augments that well. Even like Ghostly +1 or Haunted House, which are like kind of the ghostly comp specific augments, aren't going to do that well with this comp, just because those augments tend to be a little bit on the weaker side. That being said, they do give an addition to your board, so it is worth looking to get them, but it's not going to be all that much better than something like a Unified or like a Combat Caster, some generic combat augment that's just going to give your team comp a lot of strength. And the best in slot for Zyra is Shojin Nashor's +1. Death Cap is going to be the best AP item on every single AP unit in the game, so obviously go ahead and build it. You do really want to make sure you have a Spark or Shiv somewhere. You want to go AP Kale if you're leading this comp. Attack Speed and Green Kale are both perfectly acceptable, but if you know immediately that you are playing this comp, then I think Blue Kale is going to be the best, but once again, it's just not the most important. You want to generally pick the one that's best for your spot, so it doesn't matter that much. But yeah, make sure you do have a Shiv or a Spark somewhere. This comp is obviously doing predominantly magic damage, so it's going to be really important. And then otherwise, you're just filling out your frontliners with frontliner items. Whichever one you have upgraded is the one you can itemize. Obviously, I put them on Alawi in this kind of graphic, but it doesn't really matter, right? So if you have a Shen 2 and an Alawi 1, feel free to put items on Shen. If you have an Alawi 2 and a Shen 3, once again, feel free to put items on Shen. If you have an Alawi 2 and a Shen 1, then obviously you're putting items on Alawi. And same goes for, at 1 star, Alawi is the strongest unit. And once again, most of the time you're playing around Garen in the early game. So you actually have that Warden in for Alawi, right? So it's very okay to just put items on Alawi just because she's the best unit here. But at the same time, it's just going to be a game by game basis and a spot by spot basis based on what you actually end up itemizing. All right, next up we have a sniper comp, Ashe carry. This is a new way of playing Ashe that's like relatively, I guess it's relatively new. It's not all that new. I think people have explored with this build in the past. But right now it's just kind of like gone more meta because certain things have gotten nerfed, certain things have gotten buffed, such as Wardens. So you're going to see a lot more of a comp like this. I'm sure if you guys have been playing ladder recently, then you guys have already had some experience with this comp, but it's a really, really simple comp. You're just playing around 4 sniper, 4 warden. The exact 4 wardens don't matter, but obviously 90% of the time you are going to be playing around Amumu, Alawi, Nautilus, just because Nautilus is the 4 cost, Amumu gives you Porcelain, and Alawi gives you Ghostly, as well as these two are just very, very strong mid-game tanks that will kind of like tie your game over until you have like a Nautilus 2 or a Set. And then Set is obviously going to be a lower cost warden, either one of Garen or Jax most of the time, whichever one you have upgraded until you have Set. And then at 9, most of the time you're going to fit in something like a Syndra because that gives you Faded. So this comp is interesting because it does abuse augments a little bit. The sniper augments are really, really strong. So that's Longshot, Sniper Crest, and Sniper Crown are all really strong. Sniper Crown specifically being the best of them, just because Sniper Crown actually gives you your Rage Blade, which is the only mandatory item in this comp, obviously as soon as you pick Sniper Crown. So I have here on Ashe Rage Blade, i.e. Gunblade. I think it looks like that the best in slot is 3 of these 4 items, but you can put Last Whisper on someone else, or you can build an Even Shroud. So even though Last Whisper is really important for this comp, like some sort of shred component, I understand before someone in the comments says Aphelios, gives you armor shred. It's just not reliable. You do really want to have something like a Last Whisper or an Even Shroud, even if you have Aphelios, just because you just want to be more consistent with it, right? So yeah, you just want to build 3 of these 4 items on Ashe, and then you start itemizing Aphelios, and then obviously your tank items are really, really important when you play this comp. So you want to itemize Nautilus, Amumu, and Alawi. Whichever one you have upgraded first is the one you itemize. Obviously, Nautilus is the 4 cost, so it's nice to put items on Nautilus, but at the same time, you don't always have them upgraded. And Alawi and Amumu represent so much effective HP on your board that whichever one you have upgraded is just going to be the one you itemize. And then I talked about Sniper Crest and Sniper Crown, which obviously give you a Sniper +1. That opens up the opportunity to play 6 snipers. So 6 sniper is only accessible with a +1, otherwise it's only 5. And if you're playing 6 sniper, then you're going to be looking at something like this. you play 3 Warden on 8 and you go 9 for a 4th Warden, but you really want to be playing that 6 Sniper because 6 Sniper is extremely strong right now. It is just worth playing assuming you have it, and it's one of the stronger openers in the game just because Caitlyn and Senna are a pretty decent opener, assuming you can find some frontline. Obviously, snipers in general are just super reliant on their frontline, so if you have 6 snipers and you don't have a Lowy 2, Nautilus 2, or a Mumu 2, or sometimes you need all 3, then you're just not going to be that strong, right? So that is someone I'll look out for. Otherwise, if you get a Warden spat instead, so let's say I get a Warden spat, then you could actually play 6 Warden on 9. Let's just assume Caitlyn's a Warden. Then we're playing 6 Warden, 4 Sniper on 9. That's another way of going about this. But yeah, this comp is really straightforward, I think. There's not too much to kind of like think about. You're just itemizing Ashe. You put leftover items on Aphelios. You want to itemize, you can itemize up to like 4 tanks, right? All 4 of these tanks, obviously not including Jax, can receive items and still do really well. So this comp does really well in like item galaxies or like certain item augments. Maybe something like a Living Forge or Lucky Gloves kind of like stretch your team a long way, just because so many different units can use items and be effective in this comp, which isn't true for every comp. So yeah, items are really important. Obviously, all combat augments, as per usual, are really strong. I think more than other comps, this comp can use some of the stall augments, such as Ascension, but I still wouldn't be looking towards augments like that, just because in general they're a little bit underpowered right now. But I just wanted to, you know, throw that in there just to like remind people that this comp can use the stall augments just a little bit better than other comps. But once again, I would not be kind of like heavily prioritizing it just because those augments tend to be quite weak. Next up, we have a little bit of a more niche comp, but is very strong. It's a Zoe main comp. So the way kind of like it's Zoe main carry and you're playing 7 Storyweaver. There's actually multiple ways to go about playing a Zoe main, but these next 2 comps are both kind of like played around an AP-ish line. So these are like kind of like some of the comps you want to be playing if you have an AP opener. Obviously Zyra is another one, but let's get into it. So this comp is just playable if you have a Storyweaver spat. It is a decent way of kind of like enabling Zoe, who's a really strong carry now after the buffs. And you just want to just be playing blue Kale. You never want to really deviate from this. Sometimes in the early game, you'll have already picked red or green. That's perfectly fine. So long as you're 5 and 7 Storyweaver are you're picking blue, then that's fine. But this comp is so straightforward. It's a vertical comp. So obviously we already talked about how Storyweaver is the best opener in the game. So if you're opening around Storyweaver and then sometime throughout the game you got a Storyweaver spat, then you can just commit to this line. You're going to level 8 and rolling for it. Obviously, you do want to hit an Irelia at some point, but for the most part, you're just playing around Zoe main carry. Morgana is a really good off carry for this comp just because she spreads Morello really well. Obviously, she still gives you 2 traits with Alawi and Zyra. I would probably shy far away from playing this comp without a Storyweaver spat, just because if you have to cut Morgana or Alawi, the comp actually goes down in value dramatically, just because both Alawi and Morgana give about 10 to 20 AP to your Kale, which if you guys don't know, obviously Kale at 7 Storyweaver is going to be one-shotting things, and without that extra 10 to 20 AP, sometimes she actually just won't one-shot things. And because, you know, the way this comp works is that you really need to be one-shotting things or else they'll cast, it's just that 10 to 20 AP actually matters a lot more than like I guess you might think. Otherwise, important stuff to get about this comp is just to have a Shiv or a Spark. Honestly, it's pretty reasonable to have both. I think Shiv is slightly better, and you can put Shiv on Morgana or Zoe. It doesn't really matter all that much. But Shiv is slightly better because it's more consistent to have, especially when your frontline starts dying. You do want to have some frontline items on Galio. Obviously, we've seen this all before already, but Stoneplate, Vow, Redemption, all these different frontline items are really good on Galio, and it doesn't really matter exactly which ones you're building, so much as it just matters that you have this setup online. Yeah, this comp is pretty straightforward. Sometimes you can go for Zoe 3, sometimes you don't, but it's just another way of just playing around Zoe, which this is one way of doing it as well. So it's relatively straightforward. I think the augments for this comp are a little bit interesting. So as I mentioned previously with Sage and Arcanist, is that any comp that gives your Kale power is really strong. So you're going to notice stuff like Tiny But Deadly, Jewel Lotus 2 and 3 are or Jewel Lotus 1 and 2 are really strong. Sage Emblem is pretty strong. Martyr's really strong. Just anything that can give your Kale a little bit of extra oomph will kind of like stretch a long way, because Kale will start one-shotting things that she otherwise wouldn't be able to. And yeah, it's just a big diff when you get those augments versus when you don't. This comp, once again, is pretty niche just because it does require a Storyweaver emblem, but I think because it's really consistent at getting in top 4, I would definitely be angling this comp if I get the spot for it. Next up, we have Lillia main carry. This is a Lillia Morgana comp. It's relatively straightforward, I want to say, but I don't know how often you guys will have played it, just because once again it's a relatively new comp. This is the meta board. Before it got nerfed, this was the strongest comp in the game. It's been nerfed now, but it still remains like kind of like one of the best ways to play around AP items. But the thing with AP items, especially in the early and mid game, is that when you're looking to play an AP comp, you require so many rods and tiers that even though you might have an AP spot, say you open Shojin Rabadons, you still need more rods and you still need more tiers, that it's really difficult to kind of like find a way into this comp unless you kind of like have a specific way of getting your items, or you have, you know, that Shojin Death Cap or Shojin JG or Shojin Morello really early on into the game, right? This is the comp on level 8. It's just these 7 units. And then your +1 is generally going to be Wukong or Soraka. Obviously, Wukong is the better version of it. It gives you Sage and Heavenly, which is really, really strong. Soraka being played until then is perfectly acceptable, so go ahead and do that. Janna is pretty much immediately replaced by Azir. I know someone in the comments is going to tell me, okay, you lose Dragon Lord, it's not worth it. Yeah, Azir is such a better unit compared to Janna that it's pretty much worth swapping out immediately as soon as you find Azir. But obviously you don't always have Azir, and Janna is going to be perfectly acceptable until you do have Azir. Something to note about this comp versus other Lillia comps that you might be more familiar with is that in 2 Invoker Lillia, Shojin is significantly better than blue buff, and in 4 Invoker Lillia, then blue buff is significantly better than Shojin. And the reason for this is because the way Invoker works is that it generates mana on intervals of 5 or intervals of 20 based on like obviously which thing you have, right? So when you get 5 mana every 3 seconds on your Lillia, who's a 50 mana unit, when you drop from 50 mana to 45 mana, obviously because you're getting 5, then Shojin is 3 autos to cast, whereas blue still remains 4 autos to cast. However, if you're playing 4 Invoker Lillia, you're getting 20 mana, then it's much better to draw from like 50 to 30 and then having a blue buff to supplement your mana. I know it's a little bit confusing just because, I mean, this is the way Riot set up the trade tree, so it is something that you do have to keep in mind. That being said, I think blue is perfectly acceptable to put on Lillia even with 2 Invoker, but Shojin does perform significantly better than blue buff when you have 2 Invoker. And then normally you want to be itemizing both Morgana and the Lillia, just because the way these 2 units do damage is very synergistic. So obviously these 2 don't share a synergy between one another, but the way they do damage is really synergistic. And what does that actually mean? So Morgana and Lillia, the way fights work with this comp is you're pretty much blowing up the opponent's backline before pretty much their backline gets to interact with you. So this comp has a lot of backline access. That's something like a Kai'Sa or an Ashe doesn't really have. Obviously trick shots bounce to the backline, but not nearly as consistently as the damage Morg and Lillia will be able to output on your backliner. So Morg obviously puts a field down on the enemy backline, and then Lillia finishes them off with the little balls rolling towards them, and all is well. So you do really want to be able to find a way to itemize both, at least to some degree. I think Merlot and Shiv obviously are quote-unquote utility items, but they perform really, really well on both Lillia and Morgana. So whichever one you have upgraded first is the one you itemize, but it is ideally a Lillia main carry. So if you have Lillia 2 and Morgana 2, then it's better to put like kind of the non-utility items on Lillia and the more utility items on Morgana. Once again, it's not all that relevant. At the end of the day, you just want to have items on whoever you have upgraded, right? And then you scale by eventually getting 3 items on both. You can see stuff like Hui get played. Obviously, I already talked about Azir. This is the way you cap out. You can even see like maybe a set 2. This comp fits a lot of legendaries, right? So you can see like a Rock-On 2 getting fit as well. And pretty much any way you go about doing this, you're probably going to be somewhat successful, but this is a really expensive comp because you're really reliant on kind of hitting these 2-2-star, because the difference between kind of like executing the enemy backliner versus leaving them at like 1 to 200 HP is a huge difference. So it's really important that if you're playing this, generally speaking, you should be playing it from win streak, because AP win streaks in the mid game pretty easily, or you're playing it from like a gold galaxy, so you just have a little bit more gold. As you notice, the gold value of this comp is really high. So other than that, I think for augments, this comp more than others is like very generic. Even like the mythic augments aren't going to be that strong for this comp, nor are the sage augments. They're not going to be like any more boost of a power to this comp than they are for other comps. So there's not too much to look out for. I think any generic combat augment will do. So yeah, just look out for the standard combat casters, Martyr, Unified Resistance. Any of that stuff is going to be really strong. And lastly, we have a Syndra carry comp. I promised you guys that I would make a video on Syndra, and I never ended up doing it. It never ended up getting released, but I am going to fit it into kind of this video now. So yeah, here we have it. It's pretty much just playing around 4 Dryad, 5 Faded. Obviously, as you scale up in levels and in certain augments or +1s, you can get different stuff in, but you're pretty much just playing around Syndra main carry. and Ornn as your main frontliner, you want to put your Dryad spat on Thresh, and you can play 6 Dryad as soon as you get it. 6 Dryad is going to be better than 7 Faded most of the time, but obviously if you have 7 Faded without having to play all the garbage units such as Yasuo and Aphelios, then you can go ahead and play that as well. Faded Azir is a really strong way of speccing this board, because unlike in the past where you were pairing Thresh and Yasuo, in this comp you actually want to pair Syndra and Ahri. So it doesn't matter who your main carry is, you're always pairing Syndra and Ahri whenever you can, just because it turns out that the pairing of Ahri is too powerful, especially after they've nerfed Thresh. Just giving 30 to 60 to maybe even 90 AP, depending on how many Faded stacks you have, is just going to be really, really strong when it goes on to your entire team. One of the biggest mistakes, rather, I've seen people make is that once they have Set, they over prioritize lifting Ornn for the extra AD, because obviously Ornn is going to be the unit on your team with the most health, so people really want to lift and get that AD. But this is actually really, really bad positioning, because the most important thing in this comp is actually for Ornn to be printing items to Thresh. So it's actually, you need to be putting an emphasis on making sure these two are side by side and nothing else is beside Ornn. So even doing something like this is going to dramatically impact your fight, just because Ornn's going to print an item for Gnar and Thresh is not going to have an item, and your front line is going to crumble a lot faster than it otherwise would. The problem with Set is that Set gets printed a lot of AD items, and AD items are pretty bad generally in the mid fight, whereas tank items pretty much get the same value even if you're getting them mid fight or late into the fight, just because, like, say you're giving an item to Set after he ults, right? Like, does that AD item really do anything for him? Well, the answer is going to be no. So it's much better just give it to Thresh and ensure that your front line is beefier. Otherwise, the best in slot for Syndra looks something like Blue Nashor's Jewel Gauntlet. Obviously, Death Cap can replace Jewel Gauntlet, but there's a lot of different items that can kind of replace a couple different items in this. But you can go Shojin, Nashor's plus Jewel Gauntlet. Shojin replaces Blue Buff in that case, obviously. And there's just a lot of different items you can build. You can go Guard Breaker, you can go Giant Slayer. This comp struggles to kind of use swords, so you'll find yourself building stuff like a Gunblade, Shojin, and a Giant Slayer pretty often, just because it's difficult to use your sword otherwise. It sounds like given those 3 options, you're actually using your sword pretty well, but that's not that true, just because those are kind of like the more subpar options. So ideally, you would rather have none of those items, but because sword is such a bad component, you're going to find yourself building those items more often than you'd probably like to. Otherwise, it's actually really important to get a Spark and a Sunfire in this comp, pretty, unsurprisingly, I guess. But this comp actually uses Sunfire a little bit better than a lot of other comps. So you'll notice in every other comp, pretty much, I put a Morello, but this comp specifically uses Sunfire just because Syndra is a single target damage unit, and Ornn actually lives a really long time. Ornn is the tankiest frontline of the units kind of I put in, so it's fine to put a Sunfire on Ornn because he'll still be able to live and spread Sunfire to most of the units that you're going to be concerned with, and you have 0 backline access, so it's fine if the backliners don't have anti-heal on them, just because you won't be doing damage to them until your Syndra, Kindred, and Azir get on them anyway, so it's not all that relevant to kind of have that backline anti-heal. Otherwise, it's actually pretty nice to have items on Kindred as well. You should not be selling your Kindred 2 to downgrade to Kindred 1 and moving items to a Syndra 1. You should only do that if you have a Syndra 2, and arguably you shouldn't even do that. It's pretty important to have a backup Kindred 2. Sometimes you can go for Kindred 3 as well. I would actually say Kindred 3 is one of the better win cons this comp has, but obviously you can also go 9 to play something like a 7 Faded, 7 Dryad. The Dryad spat is slightly better in this comp than the Faded emblem, even though you would think the Faded emblem is better, just because you can fit 4 Dryad on 8 without playing Gnar, who, for all intents and purposes is a synergy bot. Rexa's actually pretty good because he, knocks up the units around him. Gnar does not. And you can play 6 Dryad if you hit Azir pretty immediately. So Dryad spat's a little bit better. In ideal scenario, I think you actually get both Dryad and Faded emblem. And then on 9, you can play 7/6. But it's not the most important thing in the world. Yeah, otherwise, as per usual, you're just looking for generic combat augments. And this comp is kind of tough, I think, just because I think the early and mid-game power of the Faded line is a little bit weaker than what a lot of people think. I think unless you have like a 3-item Kindred or a Thresh out of a box, you're definitely going to struggle, if not in stage 2, then definitely in stage 3. So I guess look out for that a little bit. I think it's fine because you can spike pretty hard on stage 4 onwards, but it is something worth considering when looking to play this comp. And yeah, that's the entire video. I hope you guys liked it. Once again, if you do like it, please leave a like and a subscribe to the channel. It really helps out. And if you guys have any feedback, just leave it down in the comments section below. And until next time, peace.